Very warm welcome to all of you to this online version of Tylösand Summit 2020. We are very happy to have more than 220 registered participants at the conference, a bit more than a normal crowd at a Tylösand's conference. So the overarching theme of the conference is climate change. We will have a number of sessions on different issues. Issues such as the cost of climate change, the role of international trade and trade policy, the role of the financial markets and the institutions, and global leadership and cooperation, and also what we have learned from the pandemic. Apart from being online, we also made another change this year. After approval from our speakers, we have decided to make the sessions available online after the sessions. And this means that the Chatham House rules will not be applied this year. But as always at SNS and also at Tylösand, we really encourage you to take part in the discussion in the Q&A section at the end of the session. And you can do it both by asking questions in text through the Q&A function, and you can start writing them already now or whenever you get one during the presentations. And you can also verbally ask questions by raising your hand function at the bottom of your screen. So the theme of today is international trade and climate change. More specifically, we will discuss if trade policy can and should be an instrument to fight and address climate change. Our keynote speaker has been in the center of international trade policy for decades, both as former Director General of WTO and also as former European Commissioner for Trade, Pascal Lamy. Today, you are the President Emeritus at the Jacques Delors Institute, among many other positions. And there, during the last year, you have written a number of papers on the issue on how to green EU trade policy. And the last one was published just a few weeks ago. So we look very much forward to listen to you. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to you, Pascal Lamy. A very warm welcome to SNS. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mia. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Very good. So I'll put my video on. There we are. Let me start by thanking you, Mia, wholeheartedly for your invitation. To introduce this discussion with a few remarks, which I will focus on the impact of environment protection on the EU trade policy. Climate change, of course, is one of these major environmental challenges. There are a few others like biodiversity, like our atmosphere, like our hydrosphere, which I think are also part of the picture. My starting point will be very simple. For many years, the European Union has projected itself, among other regions on this planet, as both a champion of free trade, of open trade, as I say, and a champion of environment protection. While the openness of trade was one of the founding stones of the creation of the economic community, who became the European Union, and that was a clear stance that was taken from the very beginning in the 60s. Environment protection only appeared sort of 30 years later, and materialized when Jacques Delors, my boss at the time, had this principle that EU had as a major policy objective environment protection, had it enshrined in the treaties that we use as a constitution. This environment protection axis of EU policies have grown since constantly, and they have accelerated recently, and notably after the 2019 European elections, which, as we all know, reshuffled quite substantially the balance of forces which had been traditionally established in the European Parliament, with this time a much larger weight for the Greens as a political group, but also a larger adherence of environment protection in traditional other groups like Christian Democrats or Social Democrats, so that now the Greens have a much higher level in the European Parliament, and this has translated into what we call the Green Deal, which is the new strategic roadmap of the European Union. Of course, this leads us to this question of how can we reconcile trade openness and environment protection, and this, as we know, is a complex and controversial question. I will very sketchily mention the sort of three ideological attitudes which we find on the market of ideas on this relationship. The first one is that trade is good for environment protection. International division of labor leads to a more rational use of resources, whether it's capital, whether it's labor, whether it's environmental scarce resources, and organizing our production systems so that they are more efficient, including in natural resources consumption, is the way to go. There's a second opposite school of thought, which believes that trade and trade openness, increasing trade, is bad for the environment because our production systems today do not properly internalize a number of negative environmental externalities, and of course, open trade generates a lot of traffic, a lot of transport, which is notably seen as being carbon inefficient, plus the fact that if you look at the composition of trade and the way world trade has grown in recent decades, it is true that sector-wise, there is a certain specialization of international trade in carbon-intensive products. The third school of thought doesn't say it's good or it's bad. It basically says this is not a problem we should consider. Trade is not an issue. The real issue is how to transform in the direction of more environmental friendliness our production systems, which today are harming our environment. This is not a trade issue. There is a silver bullet to do that, notably in climate, which is a proper price of carbon. Let's have a carbon price that properly, adequately internalizes the negative externalities of CO2 emissions in a global market capitalist system. And the trick is done. Markets will adjust to this change in relative prices as they do it when oil increases or decreases, or where the minimum wage in China increases, and so on. That's the way to go. This solution makes a lot of sense. The problem being that, unfortunately, it is not available. I think the notion that we very soon and in a time horizon that fits with our objectives of decarbonization of our economies, which for the European Union is now 2050, there is no way we can rely on such a solution if we want to accelerate, which we have to do, the ecological transformation of our production systems. This being the case, we are left with a series of second best options on how to internalize the negative impacts of our production systems via a trade approach. This is what I will now try and describe, although making a major point, which I think we have to have in mind at the start of any further consideration of how to green EU trade policy as a consequence of this strategic Green Deal, which is that trade is not the main dimension of the issue. And I agree with those who say, not that trade doesn't matter, it does matter for a number of reasons, but that the real focus should be on, as far as climate change is concerned, the decarbonization of our production systems, whether goods or services, and that trade policies, trade instruments are only an addition to such a major transformation. We then have to make sure that either trade policy facilitate this, or that at least they do not hamper it. Yet we have this issue ahead of us, and how to green EU trade policy is the title of a series of policy proposals, which Mia was kind enough to mention a few minutes ago, which have been published by Jacques Delors, which is one of the three European think tanks which have the name of Jacques Delors. One is in Paris, Institut Jacques Delors. It's an old one. Another one was born in Berlin 5 years ago, Center Jacques Delors, which is with the Heritage School. And then we have a third sister, which was born this year, which is called Europe Jacques Delors in Brussels, and which is specialized in environmental sustainability. Hence, this series of publication of 6 papers that take this issue of how to green EU trade policy and that propose proposals in order for this to be done in a fair, rational way. I'll rapidly describe the 3 avenues which we have explored, not least for the discussion. The first avenue is about greening international agreements, whether trade agreements or environmental agreements. The second one has to do with this major issue which we've raised, our template for the moment being the only one on the market, which is a border carbon adjustment system. And the third one is about using EU market power in areas like norms, standards, certification, to align what we import on our own EU standards. Let me start briefly by greening EU trade agreements, whether multilateral or bilateral. At the multilateral level, there are a few proposals in order to make the WTO rulebook more environment friendly. Not that it is not. The WTO was created in 1994 at a time where environmental sustainability was already a big international issue, and the WTO charters clearly states that opening trade is to the service of a number of more global objectives, such as growth, employment, and environmental sustainability. And the rules of WTO leave quite a large margin in order to reconcile, in some cases, environment protection and trade protection. And the WTO jurisprudence, the one stemming from the dispute settlement system, now allows for a good balance between what you can do to preserve your environment when it implies some trade restrictions. There are criteria. There is a notion of proportionality that allows to assess properly this balance. Now, one can go a bit further. For instance, in inventing new rules in WTO, such as disciplines on fossil subsidies, for instance, as we are trying to do it for the moment for fisheries subsidies, using trade policy reviews to give a higher spotlight on the trade and environment nexus, and other more ambitious proposals, such as an environment, a sort of green waiver, are on the table. So there are a variety of options that would make the WTO rules-based multilateral system more environment friendly, or at least to make it clear that this synergy can work. There is, of course, another domain of international regulation which has a trade and environment component, which is the multilateral environmental agreements. We have roughly 200 of them on this planet, which many people don't realize. And most of them have trade provisions that, for instance, forbid trade in endangered species or regulate trade in chemical substances and so on. The problem being that while these multilateral environmental agreements do organize legally a proper convergence, cohabitation, coexistence between some trade restrictions and environment protection, most of them are not properly implemented. And so then the issue is, how can we give more teeth, more biting power to these agreements, which have a lot to do with implementation capacity, notably in developing countries. Then there is the whole field of the bilateral trade agreements, and we know that the European Union is a major actor in this area. Not that the issue is not new. There have been progressively more environmental environment components in EU bilateral agreements, but there are many ways to go further, and notably, for instance, in making it clear that the implementation of existing international environmental agreements by our trade partners become an essential conditions of our trade agreements, which means that if they are not implemented, then the trade benefits that they imply are suspended. Second big area of movement where we made proposal is the border carbon adjustment issue. This has been floating for a very long time, and I myself, when I was European Trade Commissioner, started working on that, but at the time, and for the next 10 or 15 years from that moment, the balance between the problems such a system entails, legal problems, technical problems, political problems, economic problems, and the benefits it is meant to address, was on the wrong side. To put it simply, border carbon adjustments are about avoiding carbon leakages, which stem from a substantial difference in CO2 pricing between your domestic economy and the origin of your imports. At the time where the carbon price in the European Union was 10 or 15 or 20 euros, the complexities of this equation made it not solvable. This, of course, dramatically changes with the 2050 decarbonation horizon, which we all know will lead inevitably to quite a steep rise in carbon pricing. So whereas carbon leakages were not a big problem at 20 euro, they become a serious problem at 50, 60, 70, 80 euros, which is the carbon pricing which seems to be the one we need in order to accelerate our energy transition. This leads to the position of the European Commission, which is that we now need a border carbon adjustment, and we have tabled a model, a template that addresses most, if not totally all, the problems it raises of WTO compatibility, of capacity to measure the carbon footprint, of the impact of this on our trade relationship, including for developing countries. And let me just say that, in a nutshell, it can work if the notion that you do not discriminate your imports as compared to your domestic production is abided to. And this, in concrete terms, means, for instance, that we have to get rid of free allocations, which for the moment are a part of the ETS system, which is the market system we have for emission permits. For instance, putting a border carbon adjustment in place is something that is not compatible WTO-wise with free allocations. We've also suggested that we start with a period of test, including with the necessary contacts with other trading partners, and that we start with two sectors, which for a few years should be the ones that prove the doability and the acceptability and the efficiency of the system, which are cement and electricity, for reasons I can come back to if necessary. That's the second avenue. Third avenue, and the last one, is the use of the EU market power, which is very big in the present world. It's bigger than the US. Not that we are richer, but we are more. It's smaller than China. We are fewer, but we are richer. So for, let's say, 10, 20, 25 years to come, we still have a capacity, thanks to this market power, to influence the way others take into consideration the environment protection into their own production systems. We've had that for quite a bit of time. I was trade commissioner at a time where my good friend Margot Wallström was environment commissioner. And I remember the many hours we spent together with our experts to put together the European REACH regulation, which obliges importers to obligations of traceability of chemical substances, which we have imposed on our own producers, and which at the time we knew we had to impose on our imports. This is difficult, this is complex, but this is doable. And the fact is that the REACH regulation has become a sort of gold standard in the area of tracking chemical substances in production systems. In a way, what we've done with our GPD on data protection and data privacy is not very far from that. There are a whole host of areas like food, think about GMOs, like timber, like mobility, where we can increase the greening of our own production systems for goods, and to some extent, although in a more limited way, in services, and where the notion that this is the conformity to these European standards is checked at the border is a reasonably simple one. That's not the whole story, not least because there is sometimes a discrepancy between theory and practice. The notion that no chlorinated chicken crosses our border is not always respected for reasons that have to do with the fact that the back office doesn't always fit with the front office. And we know that if we move in this direction, and I'm convinced we will move in this direction, this issue of how do we articulate the front office of EU trade policy with the back office, which is basically custom systems, wherever they are located, is an issue that we will have to review. And this will be proposed in the last and sixth piece, which we will publish probably at the end of this year. So that's, in a nutshell, the way we believe, after having worked a lot on this issue, the way to go. It doesn't solve everything. It's complex, difficult, sensitive, and notably, because we will have to be very careful that whatever way we move in this direction, and I think the result of the European Commission is now such that we will move in this direction, we have to be attentive to the impact of this on many of our trade partners, starting with developing countries, which of course are not at the same level of sophistication, of governance, of regulation as we are, and for which putting a higher environmental protection standard in the European Union will be a problem. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, we propose that in putting together a border carbon adjustment system, the proceeds of this, when it is put in place, are directly directed to a sort of new fund, EU Development Fund for Environment Protection, that would be focused on developing countries. This is one of the many ways to try and address this problem. This is my final point. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward now to our discussion.
Thank you, Pascal, for a very rich description of your different suggestions and proposals that you have written on in this last year. Just before coming back to the panel discussion, could I ask you one question? What have the reactions been among trade partners to the proposals? And do you see which avenue do you think would be the easiest to get in place? Do you have a quick answer? Otherwise, we take it up at the panel discussion too.
No, I have a quick answer to your question, Mia, because there was a discussion last week at the WTO in one of the many committees which the WTO is about, in the Market Access Committee, where a number of countries like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, like China, like Argentina, raise this question. The problem, of course, being that for the moment, the EU Commission has not tabled a full-fledged proposal. So there is a political determination to do it. They will only table the proposal sometime next year. What we've done as a think tank, because this is the role of think tanks, is to propose a template. Now, whether the EU Commission will adopt this template or another one, and there are lots of areas where it's about fine-tuning, is unclear. The problem for the moment, of course, is that we've launched the idea, but nobody really knows how it could or will work. What will be the staging process? What will be the rate? How will we measure the carbon footprint of imports? So we are in a situation where we've given a political signal that some countries worry about, and I can understand why, while we haven't tabled the way we can address these concerns. There are ways to address these concerns, starting, of course, with carbon clubs, for instance, which is a conversation which we should start now with countries that have already put together an ETS system and that are confronted to the same problem of carbon leakage.
Okay, thank you. So now it's time to invite our two panelists. I'm very happy to have Anna Hallberg and Jan-Olof Jacques here with us to discuss the issues further. Anna Hallberg is the Swedish Minister for Foreign Trade and Nordic Affairs, and Jan-Olof Jacques is the Director General of the Confederation of Swedish Enterprises. So I would like to start to give the floor to you, Anna, please.
Thank you very much, Mia, and thank you for inviting me here today to speak about an issue that is really very close to my heart, and that is, of course, how trade policy can be used as an instrument to address climate change. Because we all know that climate change is one of the most urgent global issues. And therefore, of course, we need to move to concrete actions and to put climate on the top of the global agenda and make sure that trade and climate policies are mutually supported. And right now, I do believe that we have a momentum. In recent years, trade policy has begun to address environmental and also social sustainability issues to a greater extent. And international trade is a key tool to implement the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and I also see that trade can really support the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. And a recovery that is really sustainable in all aspects, both in economic, when it comes to social, but also, of course, environmental aspects. We do need a free, fair, and sustainable trade, international trade policy. And that policy must support the economic growth and underpin our climate goals, and also facilitate the participation of developing countries. So this is not a time for less cooperation or more protectionism. On the contrary, international cooperation is needed more than ever right now. And of course, from Sweden, as we all know, Sweden is and will continue to be a very strong voice for multilateralism. And cooperating with our partners is, of course, essential now. And in that context, we need to ensure that we have a functioning and a modern and modernized World Trade Organization. For too long, the WTO has been marked by conflicts and various deadlock between larger economies. And I think we all see now that the WTO is needed more than ever in the fight against COVID-19 and in the fight against climate change. And I see definitely that EU must take a leading role here in the modernization work. I also look forward to discussions with the new US administration, of course, in these aspects. How can we explore together how to make progress together? And we need to start with areas, I think, that we really foresee that we can have concrete results in a short term. We need to get the kind of self-confidence when it comes to making progress together. So trade and climate need to be addressed in a more concrete and forward-looking way. And I think we need to start with the next minister meeting at the WTO, the MC12, next year. And that is a conference that I might sound a bit dramatic now, but I think that could really determine the survival or the future of the organization. We must show concrete results together at that conference. And Sweden, of course, we would like to see climate-friendly technology, goods and services being underpinned by the full liberalization from tariffs and from barriers. We must ensure that modern trade is based on principles of openness and promote sustainable development. And here, I think also the ongoing EU trade policy review, which is taking place this fall, is very timely. Protectionist tendencies has been on the rise during some time, and within the EU, I definitely see there are some troubling debate where many member states mean that the global trade has gone too far. We need to focus on reshoring, and I definitely see, and from Sweden's point of view, and many other countries as well, that this makes us much more vulnerable. And I think also when we hear about the voices are raised for the EU being more autonomous, and if that means reshoring and the production needs to move back to Europe, from a Swedish perspective, we could not agree less. We won't find the solutions to today's challenges by turning back the clock. Instead, EU must invest in our common future and support the green transition of our industries and thereby strengthen the EU's long competitiveness. And that is done by an open, fair and free trade agenda. I think it's a great step that the Commission has put on a more ambitious climate goal for 2030, where trade policy really can contribute to a great extent and be really a key issue. And Mr. Lamy mentioned the EU free trade agreements, and I definitely agree. This could really provide a much more useful tool to support sustainable development. And I cannot stress enough how an effective implement of the sustainability chapters of the FTA agreements, how that is so key. Another tool, as Mr. Lamy also mentioned, it could be the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this could provide an important tool to avoid carbon leakage and to contribute to the reduction of the global CO2 emissions. But of course, any such mechanism must be compatible with the WTO rules and based on climate objectives. But I believe, and I see already today, that the European industry can and should take the leading role in transition to a circular, low-carbon economy. And major business and export opportunities can be enabled for providers of innovative and climate-friendly goods and services. And I'm very proud to say that Swedish companies and many other EU companies are involved in that transition and they really regard sustainability as a cornerstone of the business models. Sweden has the vision to become the first fossil-free welfare state, and our trade and industry is part of our effort. Swedish companies are in the forefront, and our experience shows that it's possible to cut emissions and grow at the same time. Let me just mention one example of that is a tool that is really important here to mention in this context, and it's export financing instruments. They are sometimes key for our companies to be able to compete on the global arena. And this is an area of importance to push for green transition as well. And I'm really proud to say over the decision that the Swedish government took for export credits for investments in fossil fuel prospecting and extraction, that should be ended, any kind of credit guarantees to these kind of investments by the year of 2022. So trade is the most important driver of global growth, development and employment. It's also a vital instrument for poverty reduction and fulfilling sustainable development goals. And free trade provides access to new markets, increases efficiency on resource allocation, lowers prices for consumers, and promotes, of course, access to technologies. We all know that. But I also would like to stress again that this is particularly important for developing countries, where access to new technology is really, at a lower cost, is really so crucial. And there's an obvious win-win here to combine trade policy and contribute with the transition to developing countries in this context. So finally, the challenges of our societies are great, but so are also indeed the opportunities right now. For Sweden, trade policy is a key element for us to create a more sustainable world and a competitive EU. Thank you very much.
Jan-Olof, it's your turn. And can I just, before you start, say that please feel free to put questions also live after Jan-Olof's presentation, and also write them down and we will take them afterwards. Please, Jan-Olof.
Thank you so much, Mia, and thank you for the invitation. You will notice that this is a topic where we are incredibly aligned between the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise and Businesses and with the government. So I will keep it relatively short to save some minutes for the discussion as well. I think when building back our societies and economies from the recession caused by the pandemic, whether it's been 3, 6 or 9 months from now, enhancing global trade and helping to facilitate green and digital solutions will be absolute key areas in strengthening the competitiveness, both of Swedish companies, but also of the EU. The protectionistic tendencies we now see more and more of, and during the pandemic they were particularly obvious. I think they're obviously no good for trade, but they are equally no good for the climate. For us, it's no question about whether it's trade or sustainability. It's trade for sustainability. We very recently launched our agenda on trade, and it was not just an agenda on trade, it was an agenda for free and sustainable trade. We pushed for quite a number of specific issues to push down trade barriers for green products and to facilitate the ability for Swedish and European firms to export climate-friendly products. It's no question in my mind that the most material contribution we can make from Swedish business side is to export our technologies and to export climate-friendly products. Therefore, removing barriers and stimulating trade is strongly connected to our ability to have the most material impact on climate change we can have. I fully agree, and thank you, by the way, Mr. Lamy, for a very inspiring talk. I fully agree that the main solution is not trade, but it's a part of the solution to achieve the climate goals. Decarbonizing the production system must be the main solution, but it can go much faster, and then it can globalize much faster by the support of open trade. The EU also has a very important role in my mind to push for increasing climate ambitions globally. And I think we need to push down the trade barriers for green products, but at the same time, push up the ambitions for the climate. As an organization, we represent 60,000 companies across all sectors and across all sizes of companies. We are completely committed to ensure that EU eliminates all net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. And I think the current discussion on increasing the goals for 2030, we are supportive of that. Although my personal obsession is more on action than discussing targets. I think the goal forward for EU must be to create both a climate neutral and competitive environment by 2050. If we are not competitive, I don't think we will do the best for the global climate. And we need to share this in the areas where it's a burden. In many, it's a competitive edge. But in the areas where it's a burden, I think we need to also make sure we share it in a fair way. Environmental regulation in EU must be high, and we fully support that they are high. However, they must not be so high that we cannot make our products at a competitive price level, and therefore it sort of prevents us from exporting climate positive contribution. And on the specific note of carbon border adjustment, if carbon dioxide prices differ considerably between the EU and the rest of the world, there is clearly a high risk of CO2 and investment leakage and distorted global competition. In the absence of progress towards what Mr. Lamy said is not available at the moment, a global price on CO2, carbon border adjustment may be necessary. However, it clearly needs to be compatible with the WTO agreements. It needs to be non-discriminatory, and a big challenge, I think, will be it needs to be simple to administer. It may be very different in the complexity in the first two areas of cement and electricity, and maybe thirdly coming steel and maybe aluminium after that. but the more complex, the more products and areas that are included, the more complex value chains you will face, and the more difficult it will be to administer. So it's clearly a challenge, but we need to understand the unintended consequences. I think it should be carefully considered, but it may well be necessary. Let me just round up by saying a few words on the Swedish level. Swedish businesses are far more ahead than we often talk about and recognize. I think it's far ahead, not by talking, but by acting and making climate change a very integral part of the business strategy. Sustainability is no longer a buzzword. Sustainability is now business. And I think there is a very close link between digital and climate. I steal this with pride, a quote that says, without no digital success, there will be no climate success. And that will lead us into other parts of the single market on free data flows, etc. That will be really important as well to drive the climate success. So finally, the question for policymakers now is how they can help to facilitate this ongoing development so that Swedish companies can export more climate-friendly innovations. By taking the next step, I'm sure we can enhance both competitiveness and sustainable development. And at the absolute heart of that journey will be trade. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you, Jan-Olof. I think I turn directly to two questions that are connected. And the first one is coming from the former Minister for Foreign Trade of Finland, Kimmo Sasis, who has a question: what happens if EU unilaterally introduces carbon border taxes? I will put another number two in too, because it connects. And that is a question from Jonas Nykander, one of the authors of SNS Economic Policy Council's report of this year, with the title Swedish Policy for Global Climate, which I also can say is coming in English in a few weeks. Jonas asks, how should a carbon club handle different carbon prices between members of the club? I suppose, Pascal, you have discussed those issues in writing your papers. So I give the floor to you, please.
Thanks, Mia. Greetings to Kimmo Sasi, whom I haven't seen for a long time. I hope you're doing well, Kimmo. That's not plan A. Plan A is not to start by implementing a full-fledged border carbon adjustment on all our imports. Plan A is to discuss that with our trade partners, at least in our view. I'm not speaking for the European Commission, of course. Discuss this with a number of our trade partners, check with them their position and the rationale between their position, and only check that with a number of trade partners we can work carbon club-like, and I'll come back to that in 1 minute. And then the notion that we unilaterally put this at our border only comes after a series of test processes. Like, you know, we have to cook the frog. You know this analogy with cooking a frog. If you put a frog in cold water and you turn the heat progressively, it's going to be cooked. If you heat the water and put the frog in the bowl, the frog will jump out of the bowl because it's too hot. So we have to have a progressive sort of factoring in strategy. At the end of the day, it may be that we have to do this unilaterally. And then the big issue is to make sure that it is WTO compatible. In the discussions that are taking place in various committees in the WTO presently, lots of countries are saying this cannot be WTO compatible. Such a system never or cannot be. Of course, this is wrong. Not all border carbon adjustment options are WTO compatible. but there are some which are WTO compatible and which basically abide to this problem I mentioned of non-discrimination. So you cannot use such a system to penalize your imports as per the comparable quantum on your domestic production. In these conditions, there might be, if we install this, a country that will complain to the WTO. But if we structure it in such a way that it is WTO compliant, and I mentioned the discussion I had at the time with Margot Wallström, where we had to compromise, and she had, as far as reach is concerned at the time, ambitions which at sometimes we had to diminish in order to make sure that the system would be WTO compatible, and it has worked. Second question on carbon clubs. I mean, that carbon clubs is precisely a cooperative system which is there to allow to deal with discrepancies in carbon club pricing. The main sort of issue being, how do you converge? If there is a difference, what do you do with difference? Can we accept that if you say that this difference will be reduced in time, and there are agreements on how to phase in carbon pricing in whatever way you do it, by the way, and you're well placed in Sweden to know that regulation is a way to internalize external negative externalities in climate change. Taxation is one. You've showed that to many countries, and you've been a sort of precursor in showing that if you have a carbon tax, your economy does not suffer if you do the necessary transformation in order to transform this into a comparative advantage. So carbon clubs are there to address this sort of problem. Of course, they only can start a conversation between countries that share the same notion that increasing carbon price is the way to go, and then you try to harmonize it so that it doesn't translate into carbon leakages. Now, there are a few countries on this planet, or a few regions, like in the US or California, for instance, who are or are moving to a European ETS-like system. This is the obvious candidates for the start of a carbon club conversation, which was advocated at the time by a guy called Nordhaus, which I've seen in preparing for this event, that he had been talking to you a few years ago as a sort of a precursor. I haven't had time to read what he said, but I'll do that as up.
Thank you, Pascal. Yes, we had Professor Nordhaus at our place when he got the Nobel Prize, and you can look at it at our website, the presentation. It was quite interesting, of course. So I will add another question, and that is coming from the General Director of EKN, the Swedish Export Credit Agency, Anna-Karin Jatko. And she asks, which of the many ongoing trade agreements could be first used to promote sustainability? You mentioned that as a second avenue in your ideas on how to greening EU trade policy.
Well, there have been several generations of sustainable trade agreements by the European Union. It started in the 90s. When I was Trade Commissioner, we already had this dimension in sight when we would negotiate bilateral trade agreements, which, by the way, I never initiated. I thought at the time that priority should be multilateral, so I finished negotiating free trade agreement that had been started by my predecessors, and I only started one, which was Canada, in order to test the problem of regulatory compatibility and cooperation in an economy which is very near the US. So At my time, for instance, we had introduced sustainability impact assessments. So while we were negotiating, we were factoring in the environmental impact of opening trade between country X and us. This was a rather light process at the time, which has been reinforced, and you now have not only sustainability impact assessment of the agreement, but you have a sustainability impact assessment before the agreement is signed. And you have sustainability impact assessment monitoring after the agreement is signed. So the thing has gotten more complex. We have in the latest free trade agreements which we've signed, like Japan or Canada, for instance, not a big problem, not least because we roughly are on the same line, although we still have a few issues with Canada, which has been raised by opponents to this agreement, notably in energy production and shale gas. Of course, it's much more difficult with emerging or developing countries. We have this big problem with the Mercosur agreement with Brazil. And obviously, given the behavior of Brazil in the Amazonian forest since Mr. Bolsonaro was elected president, this has created a situation where there is no way the EU-Mercosur agreement will be ratified by the European Parliament anytime soon. So we have to take this into consideration. Of course, there is an option to say, well, let's drop it. And I'm working at this as a member of the board of the European Climate Foundation. The problem being that the pro-climate constituency in Brazil says, no, please don't do that. We need you as a lever on our government to make sure that the sort of conditionality which you have in your agreement is implemented. So don't move back, but keep pressing so that what has been signed is implemented. So it's a variable geometry issue. We cannot have exactly the same target, the same objective, the same methods. The reality is that, and I put it very simply, the implementation of internationally subscribed environmental obligations, and the Paris Agreement is part of that, although we know it's done on a voluntary basis, will have more and more importance in the implementation of our trade agreements, which are by definition WTO plus in terms of trade liberalization.
Thank you, Pascal. Now, just as a final short word, it would be very nice to hear from Anna and also from Jan-Olof about the Swedish activities in Brussels and the strength of our voice, both in terms of policy side, but also from the industrial side. When you look at the future and these issues and the goals that you have stated in your introductions, who are the like-minded and how strong are we? And please, Anna.
Thank you, Mia. Well, since we really missed the UK at the table, I would say, because there we really had a free trade friend. Can you hear me now? Thank you. So we tried to find other like-minded countries, and so we're now up to 8 countries in this like-minded group that we, from Sweden's perspective, we created that in February this year, and I think we really need to be a very strong voice. We have now agreed on, last week actually we had a meeting, we agreed on in separate thematic briefs, we like to together move the EU trade agenda in what we see is at the right direction. And I think we need to focus on, of course, sustainability, but it's also how to interpret what I earlier talked about, how to the strategic autonomy issue within EU. We like to be resilient, not autonomous. We also need to push the agenda when it comes to digital trade and e-commerce, but also for services and these kind of regulations in the free trade agreements. Of course, it's so important that Sweden is a small country, but together now with 8 countries, we really can push the agenda in the right direction. And we need to take this window of opportunity now that we have in front of us. And as the EU trade policy is under review, and it will be presented in February at the beginning of next year, that we really take our initiative together here now. So I'm really positive, actually, that we can do this together, but not alone. And Sweden is really pushing this agenda together with these other 7 countries. Among those countries
are just industry.
Yes. Yeah, I would just wanted to say, we do this together with the companies, together with the business sector, of course, but because the combination here, the cooperation is absolutely key. So over to Jan-Olof.
Thank you, Anna. No, I think the fact that the UK has now left or leaving the EU makes a major difference for Sweden. We have had very similar views on trade and well, actually on most topics. It means we need to take a much larger responsibility and really step up our game. We need to also form those type of coalitions. Some of them will be relatively fixed. I think from a business side, we have a very strong collaboration with our Nordic counterparts and very similar views on the vast majority of topics. But then it may more be a question of forming groups on different topics. We have strong allies on trade in Spain, in Netherlands, and Ireland, on climate in France. Unfortunately, at the moment, maybe a little less so, I'm afraid, with France on trade. But I think the key for us here is really to be much more proactive. We can no longer rely on UK. We need to take more of a leadership role. Despite being a small country, we should take that step forward and take leadership and form coalitions. From a business side, Nordic forms a good starting point together with the Baltics, but then it's more on a topic-to-topic basis.
Thank you. I am sorry, we have to end, and it feels like this is just the beginning of a very important discussion. So I want to thank Pascal, Anna, and Jan-Olof for all your contributions today, and also to the audience. We will send out the papers that were referenced to by Pascal to you by the end of next week. But let me end also by just giving you information on the next sessions that are coming in Tylösand as part of Tylösand Summit next week. On Monday, we are discussing the impact and cost of climate change. On Wednesday, November 25, we're discussing global leadership and cooperation in light of the ongoing crisis. And on Thursday, we will talk about the financial climate change as a financial and macroeconomic risk and the role of financial market as a tool for decarbonization. You will find all the information about the program and the speakers on our website. And if you are registered for this session, you're also registered to all the other ones. Hope to see you next week. And thank you once again to all of you. Here you have the dates. Thank you and goodbye.